July 12, 1986, Wembley Stadium. The second of Queen's two sold-out shows during that summer's Magic Tour had concluded according to every official record and every piece of surviving broadcast footage, the band having completed their planned set list and their scheduled encores, the house lights beginning their gradual rise as roughly 70,000 people began the slow process of leaving the stadium. And the professional camera crews responsible for documenting the tour having, according to the account of an unnamed sound technician who has discussed this period only in limited and carefully guarded terms across the decades since, already begun the process of powering down their equipment, understanding, by every indication available to them in that moment, that the evening's performance had definitively concluded. What this technician has described in the fragments of testimony that have reached researchers through secondhand channels is a moment that occurred in the several minutes immediately following this apparent conclusion, before the stadium's house lights had fully risen. While a portion of the audience remained still gathered near the stage, rather than having yet begun their departure. A moment during which Freddie Mercury, according to this account, returned briefly to the stage microphone entirely unprompted and unannounced, performed a short and apparently entirely improvised verse that connected to no song in Queen's officially documented catalog, and then left the stage again within less than 2 minutes, an interval brief enough and unexpected enough that the professional recording equipment, already in the process of being deactivated, never captured any portion of it. The technician has described the specific circumstances that led to his own presence for this moment, explaining that his particular role that evening required him to remain at his sound position slightly longer than the camera crews, monitoring residual equipment feedback and completing the specific technical shutdown sequence that his job required, regardless of whether cameras remained active. A detail that has been cited among people who find this story credible as a specific piece of internal logic that lends the account more plausibility than it might otherwise carry. The recognition that sound technicians and camera operators typically follow different shutdown timelines based on their distinct technical responsibilities, meaning it is entirely plausible that someone in the technician's specific role might have remained present and attentive during a window when camera coverage had already effectively ended. What he witnessed, according to his account, began with Freddie walking back onto the stage from the wings, alone, without any of his bandmates, his stage costume already partially removed in preparation for departure, moving toward the central microphone with what the technician has described as a specific quality of unhurried private purpose, as though responding to some internal prompt rather than to any external cue or request from the remaining crowd. He didn't announce anything, the technician has said, according to the version of this account that has proven most consistent across the limited testimony available. Didn't say "own more for you" or anything like that, the way performers sometimes do with genuine planned encores. He just walked up to the mic and started singing, quiet at first, almost like he was working something out for himself rather than performing it for anyone else. And it took me a few seconds to even realize what I was hearing, because it wasn't any song I recognized, and I'd worked every single date on that tour by that point. The technician has described the improvised verse's general character, rather than claiming precise recall of its exact lyrical content, characterizing it as melodically simple compared to Queen's typically elaborate and layered material, closer in structure to something that might emerge from a musician working through a private musical thought rather than performing a fully composed piece. Though he has said the specific emotional register of what Freddie sang struck him, even in that moment, and even more so across his subsequent decades of reflecting on the memory, as carrying genuine and unguarded feeling, something considerably more raw than the polished theatrical performance style that had characterized the officially documented portions of the evening's much longer and considerably more elaborate show. The specific content that has survived through this fragmentary secondhand testimony, offered by the technician only in general paraphrase, rather than as any claimed verbatim transcription, suggests lyrics addressing gratitude toward the audience in terms considerably more direct and unguarded than the more theatrically framed thank yous Freddie typically offered during his officially documented performances. A specific quality of the improvised verse, apparently expressing something closer to genuine personal astonishment at the scale and duration of the audience's devotion across the band's now more than 15 years of touring together, phrased, according to the technician's characterization, less as a polished performer's gracious acknowledgement and more as something closer to a private, almost disbelieving reflection on exactly how far the band's improbable journey had actually carried them. The remaining audience members near the stage, according to the technician's account, responded with a specific quality of hushed attention rather than the roaring enthusiasm that had characterized the evening's officially documented encores, a detail the technician has emphasized as particularly significant. The recognition that this smaller, quieter crowd response seemed to reflect an intuitive understanding, even among people who could not have known this moment was entirely unplanned, that they were witnessing something different in kind from everything that had preceded it that evening, something considerably more intimate despite occurring within the enormous physical scale of a sold-out stadium. Freddie's departure from the stage following this brief improvised moment was, according to the technician's account, as understated as his arrival had been, no formal goodbye, no extended bow, simply a quiet turn away from the microphone and a walk back toward the wings, disappearing from view within what the technician has estimated as less than 2 minutes total from his initial unannounced return to the stage. The technician has said that he mentioned what he had witnessed to a small number of colleagues in the immediate aftermath, several of whom expressed regret at having already begun their own equipment shutdown and therefore having missed the moment entirely, but that the general consensus among the crew members who discussed it that evening involved a shared understanding that this was not the kind of moment that required or invited further documentation or discussion, an unplanned and evidently private gesture that had happened to occur in a public space rather than a performance genuinely intended for broader capture or distribution, a distinction that touring crew members across the entire industry, according to people who study this broader professional culture, generally understand and respect even when their own jobs otherwise involve the near-total documentation of everything a major touring act does on any given evening. This particular account has never been corroborated through any additional independent source willing to speak with sufficient specificity to confirm the technician's testimony, and researchers who have attempted to verify it against the extensive surviving footage from Queen's 1986 Wembley performances have confirmed only that the officially released and archived recordings of both nights conclude at points consistent with the technician's general timeline, offering neither confirmation nor contradiction of whether anything additional occurred after the official recording equipment had been deactivated, a gap in the documentary record that, by its very nature, cannot be resolved through examination of footage that, if the account is accurate, was never actually captured in the first place. What lends this story a specific durability among the people who have encountered it, despite its reliance on a single, largely anonymous secondhand source, is its coherent alignment with a broader and considerably better documented pattern in Freddie Mercury's relationship to live performance across his career. Numerous separate accounts from bandmates, crew members, and journalists across multiple decades consistently describing a performer who frequently seemed to draw genuine and sometimes visible emotional sustenance from the specific scale and duration of audience devotion that Queen's career had achieved, a pattern that would make an unplanned, unguarded and unrecorded moment of exactly this kind, entirely consistent with the broader personality the more extensively documented historical record otherwise supports. Brian May and Roger Taylor have never addressed this specific alleged moment in any interview where researchers have been able to confirm the question was directly posed. Though this absence of confirmation carries somewhat ambiguous evidentiary weight, given that Freddie, according to the technician's account, appeared to be alone on stage during the incident, meaning it remains entirely plausible that neither Brian nor Roger witnessed it directly or was subsequently told about it by Freddie himself, who may have understood the moment, if it occurred, as belonging entirely to himself and to whatever remained of that specific evening's audience, rather than as something requiring further discussion even with his own closest musical collaborators. The specific date, July 12, 1986, situates this story within a period that biographers and researchers have increasingly come to understand as carrying unusual private significance for Freddie. Occurring within the same general summer as the Nebworth concert that would, weeks later, become his actual final live performance, and within the broader documented pattern of the various private statements, the Budapest quote about being alive to return, the tour bus conversation with John Deacon, that suggest Freddie may have been operating across that entire summer, with some private and increasingly consolidated awareness of his own mortality, even in advance of any formal medical diagnosis that would not arrive until more than a year later. Whether the specific improvised verse the technician describes genuinely occurred exactly as he has characterized it, whether its content carried the specific emotional weight he has attributed to it in his own retrospective characterization offered decades after the fact, or whether the story represents some combination of genuine memory and the kind of narrative elaboration that tends to accumulate around famous performers across decades of informal retelling, remains, like so much of the testimony surrounding this particular period of Freddie Mercury's career, permanently unresolved and likely permanently unresolvable given the fundamental absence of any recorded evidence either confirming or contradicting the account. What the story offers, regardless of its ultimate verifiability, is a specific and compelling illustration of exactly the kind of private, unrecorded gesture that may have characterized far more of Freddie Mercury's relationship to his own audiences than the extensively documented and endlessly replayed official recordings alone could ever fully capture. The suggestion that behind the meticulously produced and thoroughly archived performances that have defined his posthumous legacy, there may have existed a parallel history of smaller, unguarded, entirely private moments, offered not for any camera or any subsequent audience, but simply for the specific handful of people who happened to remain present in exactly the right place during exactly the right 2 minutes on one July evening in 1986, when the official show had already ended and something else, briefer and considerably more intimate, apparently began.